This is New York City as it looks today in March of 2025. Times Square, the place where they celebrate the new year every year, year after year. But what if we're interested in yesteryear? What if we went back in time 1 year? I bet most of us would like to go back 1 year, when you could still afford eggs, when you still had a job, or just to do things differently, make better decisions, do what you wish you had done when you had the chance, or not do what you wish you didn't. I think most of us would be down for that for just 1 year. Because going from 1 year to another, aside from the events of our lives, there isn't usually a lot different. If we went back by just 1 year, there would be different songs or movies than what are on the top of the charts today, but otherwise it'd be literally the same old song and dance, and pretty much everything looks the same. But what if instead of looking back a year, we go 10 times that far, and not look back at our own lives, but to the world as it was? From the point where I am now in 2025, we're talking 2015. Again, it's not a lot different, is it? It's hard to find electric cars on the road, and even harder to find a way to charge one. The movies that you see on the marquee are familiar, but they're not old movies, not yet. That was just 10 years ago. If you woke up alone when you're supposed to be alone in your home or hotel room 10 years in the past, and you couldn't find your phone, you might even go to a diner and get a cup of coffee or whatever before you realize that you're in the wrong time, because most things still look pretty much the same. But what if we look back 10 times that? Not just a year or a decade, but a century. This is New York in 1925. And now things are noticeably different. Oh, but it wouldn't look like that to a time traveler, would it? It would look more like this. And now, nobody has a phone. Movies are all black and white, and they're all silent films. You can still go down to the cinema and watch Nosferatu, just like you did a few months ago, but it'll be a very different experience. Still, most of us could adapt to this world if we woke up in it. We'd have to learn how to make a living all over again, but it could be done. I couldn't be a social media influencer because there's no such thing as any of that yet, but I could still be a writer. There are no computers, not even TV yet, but it's possible to have a radio in your room. You'd be reading books again. The cars are all inefficient, uncomfortable, and dangerous to drive in, but you can have one, or you can ride a train. It's even possible to take a plane, although with propellers it's a lot slower, and we can't fly over the ocean either. Not yet. But if you need to get to Europe, there are luxurious ships. So you could manage living in this world, but it'd be best if you bring some gold bullion with you. Of course, some people would still have more trouble than others back then, because social situations, all of them, were even worse than the technology of the day. The world was much more violent and intolerant then, too. Shame that some people think that those were the good old days. But what if we go back even further than that, by another order of magnitude? Not a year, a decade, or a century, but a millennium. What if we retroject from when I am today to 1,000 years ago? Now we're talking about the year 1025. My, how much has changed. What was Times Square a moment ago now belongs to the Powhatan people. There are still streets of a sort, I guess, and these are technically buildings, though not, hardly skyscrapers. But have fun figuring out how to make a living in this world. No phone, no light, no motor car, not a single luxury. What you do have are passenger pigeons. Billions of them. They're all over this place. You've never seen one before because they were hunted to extinction and the last one died in 1914. But centuries ago, they were the most common bird in the whole world. 1 out of 4 birds was a passenger pigeon. Way back in the year 1025, there was no New York. There was an old York, but it wasn't much better than the Powhatan village. And because languages evolve just like animals do, if you went back to Old York 1,000 years ago, you'd have a hard time understanding anyone because the English language isn't really English yet. Now, some cities you know of already existed back then, like London or Paris, but they were not nice places to be yet. Then there was also Rome and Athens, but they weren't such nice places to be anymore. And if you still want to get to any of these cities abroad, there are no luxury liners available. If you started out from where Times Square will be, then a Viking Drakkar is your best option to get to Europe. In fact, it's your only option, and it's not a good option. It wasn't a good option even then. If you could find the few Vikings who ever made it to North America, and you could secure passage on their craft without them killing you and without sinking along the way, you still wouldn't have a moment of comfort. Just cold, wind, and rain. To say nothing of how awful all the food is. Bastard! So if you're going to try time travel, it'd be best if you could pack a sailboat with weapons and supplies and maybe something to trade with the locals if you ever need anything from them. And now let's say that you go back another order of magnitude. Instead of 1,000 years, let's look back 10,000 years. Now we could say that this is 7975 BC. That's 7,975 years before our current calendar. But that wouldn't make any sense because this is before any calendar. There are still a couple of cities you've heard of, like Jericho and Damascus, along with a few other cities that existed back then but do not exist anymore in our time. I think it would be wonderful to go back and see some of these ancient cities in their heyday. But if you're prepared to venture out into the wilderness and to really rough it up completely off-grid, then this world would be a beautiful place. It was a little cooler, but basically the same climate as we have today, with vast forests here and there, with millions more animals everywhere you look, both on the land and in the sea. And not just the ones you know of either, but some that you've never seen alive, like woolly mammoths. And several islands had their own species of giant birds. And if that's the sort of thing you like, then what if we instead set our dial to another order of magnitude and go back 100,000 years? If you're in North America, then you've got the whole continent to yourself. And you'd better be in the southern part, closer to the tropics, because the climate was a lot colder back then, with massive glaciers year-round all over the northern half. And watch out for the wildlife, because there were dire wolves and massive, aggressive, short-faced bears, but it wasn't just wolves and bears back then. You might even get run down and eaten by giant flightless birds. In North and South America, there were smilodons, as you know, the so-called saber-toothed tiger, and there were other scimitar cats as well. But there were also American versions of cheetahs and leopards and lions. And the American lions were somehow even bigger than the African lions. If you went to Australia, there was a sort of marsupial lion at that time called Thylacoleo. Wherever you are, and whatever continent, the wildlife is a lot more abundant and a more imminent threat, partly because there are no cities anywhere. Everywhere is wilderness. And there were plenty of people, at least in the old world, even genetically distinct races. The race of Homo sapiens were mostly in Africa then. Other races of Neanderthals and Denisovans were spread all across Eurasia, and there were traces of Homo erectus descendants throughout Indonesia. And this is one of the reasons I would love to at least be able to send a drone back and covertly record how each of these cultures lived. Better that than to show up in person and become the center of attention that changes everything immediately. If you're only interested in your own ancestry, then we'd be in Africa, where there were earlier versions of elephants, hyenas, and warthogs, and such things that are familiar, but more impressive versions than what we have today. If you're in Asia, you might meet Gigantopithecus, a relative of orangutans, but much bigger than any gorilla. At this point in paleohistory, there are rhinos in Europe, and they are as different from modern rhinos as the European mastodons are to modern elephants. The oceans are teeming with life, including millions of whales of different species. Animals are abundant everywhere because men haven't yet begun the full-scale industrial systematic hunting and fishing and deforestation and pollution that wrought the Anthropocene extinction event that is the modern day. Now let's accelerate our time travel another 10 times faster, to jump back 1,000,000 years. It's funny that one of my favorite movies as a kid was 1,000,000 Years BC with Raquel Welch in a bunny fur bikini, because here we are in that year, and it doesn't look like that at all. The people from that movie would be better representative of them set in 100,000 years, where we were a moment ago. And the dinosaurs, those are still way back even from this point that we've just come to. We're still in the middle of what most people would refer to as the Ice Age, though the world is beginning to look a bit different than what we're used to. Not only because the massive amounts of ice all over the land has lowered the sea levels so much that you can actually walk from France to England and hike most of the Indonesian archipelago without getting your feet wet, but also because many of the animals are earlier versions than we're used to. For example, Dinopithecus was a giant baboon, bigger than any man. Talk about nightmare fuel. And there were no giraffes yet, but there were obvious precursors of them, and look how big these are. But if different is what you're looking for, then let's push back another 10 times faster. From 2025, we retroject by 10 million years, which puts us in the late Miocene epoch. If you took my earlier advice about loading a sailboat and you got one like this, then, how do I put this?
You're going to need a bigger boat.
Yeah, because in these waters, if the megalodon doesn't get you, Leviathan might. So make sure you only take a dinghy out when you're moored in very shallow water close to the shore. Even then, if you're in North America, you may see desmostallions, which are not sea cows, but look a lot like cows in the sea. And there are also bear dogs, like Amphision, relatives of both bears and dogs, as well as early dogs, like Epicyon. Imagine an English Mastiff of one that has no history of nor inclination for domestication. This is definitely not man's best friend, not something you want to pet, more like a wild version of Cujo, a dog who sees you only as food. And these brutish dogs were known as bone crushers. North America also has Nimravids, a lineage of pseudocats that also had saber teeth, while in South America there was a Mediterranean version of that called Thylacosmilus, which is closer to a marsupial than a placental mammal, but it too had saber teeth, coincidentally. Speaking of big teeth, let's look at tusks. If you're in or around Africa at this time, most of the elephant relatives have 4 tusks, and some of them look like scooping buckets of backhoes. Very weird. There were also hyenodons, like the massive Megistotherium, and they're not super efficient nor especially fast, but if they ever get a hold of you, they have the ability to bite you in half, like a pair of scissors. If you're in South America, then you still need to worry about giant flightless terror birds, but watch the skies too, because Argentavis is a vulture that's so big that it wouldn't have to wait until you're dead. Interestingly, Europe at this time is swarming with apes. There are no gorillas or chimpanzees yet, but there are about 40 species of Dryopithecus. None of them are knuckle walkers, and some of them walk on all fours, but on open hands, and others walk upright on just 2 legs, just like people. You can find Dryopithecus in Africa too, and of course in Asia as well. I could spend a long time on each of these times, but this time we're talking about deep time. So now we're going to speed up again and retroject from the modern day back 100 million years. This skips most of the Cenozoic era and puts us in the mid-Cretaceous period of the Mesozoic era. Finally, we see non-avian dinosaurs. We have to say non-avian dinosaurs because all birds are dinosaurs, but not all dinosaurs are birds. Here we have birds and other dinosaurs living together, including a bunch of different types of feathered dinosaurs. Not all dinosaurs had feathers, but several of them did, and some of them are like partly, maybe mostly, but not quite almost birds. Others definitely could not be confused with birds, even though they got feathers. There is as yet no Tyrannosaurus rex, nor the giant Asdarchid pterosaurs either, but there are obvious ancestors for both. There are no brontosaurs or stegosaurs anymore because they died out a long time before the moment that we've come to now. But there are ceratopsians and ankylosaurs and still several massive sauropods. For those of you who took my advice and bought a schooner, understand that modern maps won't be reliable anymore as the continents have shifted so much and the sea level is so much higher now, because at this point in history there are no permanent ice caps at both poles. Antarctica is green for half the year, and Florida is entirely underwater. In fact, you can sail over Texas and Kansas and so on all the way to Canada, because the North American continent was divided in half by the Western Interior Seaway. Europe is basically just a chain of islands. And there's a whole other ocean called the Tethys Sea sitting between Asia and India, because at this time the Indian subcontinent is just an island out there on its own. Bear all that in mind and make course adjustments as necessary. Also, be wary of sharks, of course, like always. But remember that in these waters, there are also other man-eating fish, like the 20-foot Xiphactinus, which is as big as the biggest great white shark, but it moves even faster. These waters also hold plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs, both of which are bad enough. But there are also mosasaurs and pliosaurs, and these massive sea monsters make modern sharks look like bait. So again, it will be dangerous to get from ship to shore, but then the land is pretty dangerous too. And finally, if we did this one more time, and we can only do it one more time because we'll run out of time and be out of time sometime before time began. But if we retroject to 1 billion years ago, we'll skip right over practically every part of paleohistory. I'm missing most of the Mesozoic era and all of the Paleozoic before finally landing in the Proterozoic eon. Be sure to wear sunscreen and an oxygen tank, because way back then, the atmosphere wasn't breathable yet. You may need to dress for extreme cold, too, as it was a whole other ice age that froze most of the world at once. At this time, there is no hint of any life on land, and all there is in the sea are unicellular microbes. There are both prokaryotes and early eukaryotes, amoebas and such, along with some forms of algae. So in a sense, it's a lot like what some scientists think about finding life on Jupiter's moon Europa, with microbes living under the ice. But the Earth at this time does not look like our world. There's not going to be any good fishing, and this is not a place you want to be. Whatever maps you have are going to be unintelligible nonsense because the continents are unrecognizable. But that doesn't matter because there's nowhere to go to see anything interesting. May as well be on Europa. It seems unfair to race back this far and miss everything interesting along the way. I guess we're using a wormhole method of slipping out of one time and immediately into another. The problem I have with that is that what do you anchor to? If you want to move forward in time, you can put yourself in stasis and lock onto the ground you're sitting on, at least your position on the planet. Then when you get where you're going, then you'll either fall if the ground has eroded, or you'll be buried in new deposit. But going back in time, there's no foundation, nothing to cling to. So you wouldn't get out in the same geographic location where you started. You might end up in deep space, where the Earth was at the moment that you left, with no way to get back. Oops. Assuming that you get that fixed, would it be better if it took time to travel? I don't know, but it would help show how far these distances are, or rather, how deep time goes. And let's say that instead of simply going backward in time at the same speed that we go forward, how boring would that be, taking a year to go back a year? Let's say we can go faster, much faster, really fast, like 1 year per second. So let's look at what we just did at that rate of speed. It takes 1 second to go back 1 year, 10 seconds to go back a decade, a minute and a half to go back a century, 16 or 17 minutes to go back a millennium. It would take nearly 3 hours to go back 10,000 years. And you'd have to sit in your schooner or other time machine for a day and a half if you wanted to go back 100,000 years. You'd have to live there for a week and a half to go back 1,000,000 years. And you'd be there for almost 4 months if you tried to go back 10 million years. You'd already be out of supplies before you ever got off. And you'd never get to see any dinosaurs because that'd take years. To see much of anything beyond that would take decades. Time travel may be entirely impossible, but it's fun to think about. And if I'm not already busy and I need a new series, I could go back to 1 billion years ago to the Neo-Proterozoic era and do a new episode to show some of what was known about every geologic period after that. If I did, I'd call that series Paleocenes, because I like that name. As I said, we'll go back in time when I have the time, if I can time it right. I try time after time, but I haven't had time in quite some time. At this time, I don't have time to make time, but maybe next time. Till that time, maybe I'll see you around sometime.